Welcome to Central St Martin's. My name is Jeremy Till. I am the head of Central St Martin's, and in a former life was an architect. So I have an interest in what we're going to hear this evening. Indeed, was part of the group which kicked around the ideas and then we landed on beauty as a topic. It's fantastic to see so many people here, I think for good reason, for the quality of the people about to come on stage. And I'm really keen that we continue these kind of public sessions on issues of the day. Last year in Central St Martin's we had over 400 public events with over 100,000 people visiting. So it's become in this new building a place where discourse and events can happen. And I think that the fundamental series, which was put together by Mel Dodd, who's about to come on stage, and Ollie Wainwright, is exemplary of how Central St Martin's spatial practices has seized a topic of the moment and had these debates. And the audiences have got bigger and bigger and bigger, and I think this is the biggest we ever had. So many welcomes to you, and I hope that you enjoy this evening and come back for the other two in the series. So I'll hand over to Mel Dodd, who's Programme Director of Spatial Practices.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I'm not really going to do much more than just welcome you again and introduce myself. So I'm the Programme Director of Spatial Practice. We're hosting this evening, and so you're our guests, which is great. We've got an amazingly large audience and a lot of external public people. So it's, as Jeremy said, it's really great to welcome you, and thank you for coming. Just to give a bit of context, Fundamentals is a series that's now in its third year. And it's been an opportunity for us as a programme to start to ask questions about some of the fundamental forces that get under the skin of architecture and affect the built environment. So it's very much pursuing our mission, trying to ask questions that go beyond easy ones. And so it's been a really great vehicle. And of course, to do that, we've engaged Ollie Wainwright to help us. And so it's been a collaborative effort and one that's also been really important in building some culture in our programme. So that's all fantastic, and I hope you enjoy the evening. I'm going to briefly encourage you to start to think about questions that you might want to ask. It's a very discursive format, so don't be shy. We have roving mics in the second half, and so get warmed up for that. And without further ado, I want to introduce Ollie, who is, you will probably all know, Ollie Wainwright is a journalist and is also Guardian critic of architecture. He has driven really the agenda of this series, and it's been really fantastic to have him as a collaborator. So he's going to introduce tonight's, this series theme and tonight's debate and guests. So hand over to Ollie. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel and Jeremy, and thank you all for coming. Can you hear me? Okay, this is working. Yeah. Okay. So for loyal audience members who've been here for the past 2 years, you'll know, as Mel has already said, that Fundamentals was kind of set up as a means of kind of unpicking and tackling the often invisible forces that shape our built environment and that are shaping London. Over the last 2 years, we've tackled everything from the kind of roots of the housing crisis to the iniquities of the planning system, to the problems with our land market, to the role of industry in the city, the quality of public arts that developers are commissioning. Last year, we looked at the precarity of labour and the exploitation of the workforce. So we've looked at all the crucial, important topics. And we're racking our brains. What on earth could we do in the third and final year? When I mentioned beauty, there were kind of frowns all around the table. It's the most unfashionable topic an architecture school could possibly bring themselves to discuss. For years, it's been a dirty word in architecture departments. We're very happy to talk about our projects being socially engaged, being kind of tectonically poetic, being contextually driven, being the kind of product of programmatic requirements. But I think hardly ever would a student dare to stand up in a crit and say, I've done this because I think it's beautiful. They'd probably be kicked out of the program. So tonight, hopefully, this is going to be one of the first moments of challenging the kind of embarrassment and shame of talking about beauty and talking about aesthetics head on. I think the same is true of talking about the public and what the popular is. Again, architects are really fond of saying, they're listening to the users and the communities and doing all kinds of public engagement and participatory board games. But are we actually interested in what people want? The style of architecture that people want to live in. The fact, I think, that Poundbury is still seen as the kind of butt of so many architecture jokes suggests that we haven't really got it. If you speak to anyone that lives in Poundbury, they adore it. And behind this kind of pilastered facade, I would argue it's a model of a mixed development. It's one of the few new suburban projects which actually mixes housing with industrial space, workspace. It's a kind of real urban plan. Now, it's said that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that it's a totally subjective thing. But is that true? Can we work towards some kind of basic consensus on what is welcome in the built environment and what actually constitutes a blight, about what makes a good neighbor or a hated carbuncle? If there is some kind of general public consensus on beauty, how can we actually determine what that is? And is it actually architects' and house builders' role to serve popular taste, or as professional tastemakers, is it our role to be setting the agenda ourselves? So with me to debate some of these questions and many more, we have 5 speakers from across the spectrum of house building, of housing policy, of architecture, aesthetic philosophy, and teaching. We're going to begin with Sir Roger Scruton, esteemed philosopher of aesthetics, author of numerous books, and chair of the government's new Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, which is one of the triggers for choosing beauty as the topic of this series. After Roger, we're going to hear from Liza Fior, the founder of Muff Architecture Art, who I'm sure is familiar to many of you in the audience, given that she's been a visiting tutor here for the past few years. Following Liza, we're going to hear from Andrew Whitaker, who's the planning director of the Home Builders Federation, the organization that's charged with representing the interests of the house builders. Interestingly enough, of all of the volume house builders that I approached to take part in this series, all of them declined, saying they weren't quite ready to talk about beauty. After Andrew, we'll be hearing from Deborah Garvie, who's policy manager at the housing charity Shelter. She leads on all of their work on homelessness. After Deborah, we'll hear from Neil Pinder, who probably taught a few of you in the audience. He's a design and technology teacher at Graveney School in Tooting, which I think is probably one of the few high schools which actually teaches architecture. Neil established this groundbreaking kind of architecture club and has inspired a lot of students to go into the profession. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Sir Roger Scruton.
Press it, do I? Okay. Thank you very much for this and for inviting me. It's an extraordinarily large audience has assembled. I was told that in order to capture your attention, I would need slides. So I've produced quickly out of my store of such things some pictures which are probably not at all relevant to what I'm going to say, but I shall put one of them up to begin with. When talking about beauty in this context, we're not talking about great works of art. Most of us are not capable of producing great works of art. Most architects also. The great Austrian architect Adolf Loos said that architecture becomes an art only in 2 contexts: when making a tomb or when making a temple. In other words, when building something for the non-existent. And we are talking about the buildings that we build for ourselves, for people who have to engage with life and find a shelter and a job of work. And this ordinary concept of beauty is something that we do use all the time. And we don't aspire to greatness, but we still aspire to making things fit. And here's an example I give you of characteristic everyday ugliness, which you see all over our country at the moment. It's behind Reading Station. You will notice that the randomness of everything, that nothing connects. There aren't any people. People flee from this, although it was meant to welcome people into the centre of the town. Nothing ties up, nothing stands, and you can't adapt it. When it lost its use 10 years ago, it remained just like that. It is unadaptable building, and in fact, in general, it is only if a building looks nice that people have the motive to adapt it. And in the situation in which we are now, adaptability is absolutely essential, I think, to new building. Everything is changing too fast to remain in one function only. So, oh, I got it all wrong. So here is an ordinary street of the Victorian and late Georgian vernacular, which you see all over our country in the little towns and villages here and there. You'll notice that there's nothing sublime here, nothing special. There's no great work of art. Nobody knows who built these things. But their elementary principles of fittingness have been observed. The buildings are aligned with each other. They stand vertically. They have a common scale and common gentle materials. The edges are properly defined. The shadows are used in order to make things stand out. And of course, people fit naturally into it. Here you see that the humanization that architecture can produce. Now, the history of the early 20th century and mid-20th century, rather, was the history of the replacing of those aligned streets with blocks in open spaces. Here is a characteristic example, actually from Canada. But it happened all over Britain as well in the wake of the Second World War. And most people now, looking back on it, will say, wasn't that a disaster? Those blocks behind will be themselves demolished in 10 or 20 years. And nobody is happy to be in the place. There is no place there. As Gertrude Stein said of her hometown on revisiting it, there's no there. And that famous remark was taken up by Bill Clinton in another context. So if we take away all those old ways of building, we lose a lot of things that are precious to us. We lose nooks and crannies. Here's a little nook from old Rome, where bits of late antique architecture have been fitted into a modern garage. Here is a nook from Reading, which is not a nook at all, or a cranny. It's just a collection of debris. So this, if you take away all those old ways of building, you know that you're on the way to a disaster, like the center of downtown Detroit. This isn't an aesthetic disaster only. As you can see, those buildings are emptying rapidly. They're going to have to be pulled down at huge environmental cost and leave an empty space. Luckily, some hippies have moved in and planted rocket and Basle, so there is a new form of life growing in the shadow, but nevertheless, that's an unusual thing. People say that we should not be disputing about matters of taste, that beauty, as Oliver said, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. De gustibus non est disputandum. There's no disputing about matters of taste. But I think people are coming to realize that that's not true. That from the very earliest moment of human life, we make judgments of taste. We like some things, dislike others, and we can educate those judgments, argue with them. And children begin from a certain position, loving bright colors and things that stand out, and gradually moderate their taste to fit the taste of others. Here's how many children might start, with a color that we would all dismiss as garish, and you recognize not only is it horrible in the dress on the left, but it has a form of life going with it in the bedroom, which you might dismiss as pathological. In any case, this we think of as something out of which children should grow. And if they don't, and if we get architecture that hasn't grown out of that, we are in many ways repelled by it. We think this is not part of a proper civilized environment. This is built for babies. Here are 7 arguments against children, which I invite you to take away with you to think about. Have I got to stop?
I'm trying to get rid of this noise.
Oh, yes. Oh, right. Oh, do you mind this background noise? You're not listening to it? No. No, I'm fine. I'll carry on. Okay. Okay, I've got this is just to reflect on those primary colours and the absurdity of the composition, and you'll recognise that children have to grow out of their taste.
I have to lose
It is too distracting.
Maybe it's on someone's computer.
If I shout louder, is that better?
Yeah, when you finish, and then we
Okay. Let me give you another picture of children. Here are two children who've grown out of that state of mind and are actually trying to make a genuine aesthetic choice. They're trying to fit things together. And this is what it is to be aesthetically educated. You can see from the expression in their faces that they're moving things together so that they relate to each other, so that there is a harmony and a fittingness in what they do. Of course, they're producing bowls for people to eat out of. It has a functional meaning, but that's not how they're looking at it. They're looking at it not just in terms of its function, but as an end in itself, something which is a pleasure to look at and which has a meaning, therefore, a social meaning. They're not just fitting those dishes to the table, they're fitting themselves and the table to a community. And that, I think, is largely what aesthetic judgment does for us. It is a way of seeing the ends of our lives, not reducing everything to a means. And when you have something, an environment where everything is just a means and nothing is an end in itself, you have Los Angeles, from which people flee in their millions. Nobody lives there. They live elsewhere, and the elsewhere is a place of non-communication. So one part of traditional architecture, which I've always defended, although it's only one form, is the classical tradition of the orders, in which people strove to see how horizontals and verticals connected, why it is that shadows connect things and separate things, why there should be edges, and how you can develop a kind of grammar through which things relate to each other. And they're using that grammar, build bigger and bigger until you've got a harmonious street or a whole town centre in which things fit together and don't clash. And I think having learned that grammar, you can go on to do incredible, complicated things like this, or you can strip the grammar away and do simple things like this. And that, I suspect, is the way in which we will now have to go in order to recuperate what remains of the human spirit after the disasters of early mid-20th century architecture. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, many thanks for that, Roger, and especially for competing with the mystery voice coming from the speaker. Hopefully that's sorted now. Next up, we have Liza Fior, who, as I mentioned, is founder of radical architecture and art collective Muff. It's up to you.
No,
you
can
can
look at the pictures, because
That's better.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I did almost say I was feeling a bit ill, but then I came because I did read Building More, Building Beautiful. Sadly, I think it's still a little bit jerky, so somehow it's a collection of a number of voices, but I am going to refer to it today. So these are 3 images from 3 projects by Muff Architecture Art, and in all of them, members of the public said it's beautiful. And particularly the centre and the one on the right could be said to be everyday beauty, because one is Barking Town Square at the end of the metropolitan end of the tube line, and end of the line. And whereas the other is the Science Museum. And so I have had the pleasure of that sort of contentment when things are deemed to fit. They've been appropriated. They're no longer ours, and they've become part of the city. We have also worked on a number of housing projects in London, mixed tenure, dense. We've had the big discussions at planning, and in those projects, too, I'm lucky enough to have had those moments of people saying, it's beautiful, Liza. And to do it is difficult. To make things where people say it's beautiful are difficult. because we always have to spend more time. The briefs are written and somehow describe the austerity with which they're written, because they haven't been developed, and they have to be developed, and the situation has to be understood, and the extra time has to be put in, and the care of things being put and aligned together has to be put in. And it's not all about surface, but surface is important. So I'm going to start with a cover of Building More and Building Beautiful. And here it shows, I assume, a built more and built more beautiful building. But it is a composite building. And it's a composite building where, number of buildings, where perhaps, as in the whole document, which is full of focus groups and questions, perhaps the question which was asked was, do you like balconies? But the question which was not asked was, do you like going on your balcony? Because you can see that this particular piece of architecture, which is being proposed by Policy Exchange and the Commission, is a balcony you can't step out onto because the windows don't reach it. And so, just top tip. And it is important to make space to ask questions. And there are so many questions which aren't asked when planners determine what goes where. Because making money can be ugly. Once people have made money, they tend to like to spend their money on beautiful things, which is why the Financial Times has a supplement called How to Spend It. If you look at this week's issue, it has a number of modernist buildings you can buy. But while you're making the money, ugly things happen. Like, for example, schools get built on the cheapest land. And the top one is the latest, a relatively late master plan from the LLDC, where the choice was made to put the housing on the canal, the school by the most polluted and cheap site. And so when we think about land values, perhaps other values need to come into play, and I think that's something which Sir Roger would support. And also in the document, it recommends that an architect should be paid to talk to local people so that their views can go back to whatever the developer's going to do. I agree that having an independent voice, in this case, this is a slide where we worked with Daisy Froud, and she made sure that the things people said about the project, Marion Court in Hackney, were reminded to the architects. Perhaps that's called a design review panel with non-architects on it. There are many diagrams in Building More and Building Beautiful, and another sort of tip is, don't ask questions unless you want to hear the answers. So the question was, suppose for a moment it was your responsibility to decide to look and feel new homes for people in London, South East, which would be the following features you'd include. Top, thick soundproof walls. And that's interesting because it's a recognition of what is necessary to live well together, is to not have to listen to each other. Number 2 was more space. And this quote comes from the London Design Guide. So the recommendation is, let's have more building codes. Let's make some empirical rules. So here, the London Design Guide asks for sufficient space to work. And these show the area to work is in orange, tucked next to the sofa where you have an uninterrupted view of the television. One of the really strong ideas in Building More, Building Beautiful is that ceiling height should be raised. And that's a good idea, because if you've high ceilings, you can get more storage off the floor and have more space for other things which are perhaps necessary by people who don't get to vote. So where do you make space to play? And where does the next great artist learn about proportion if they can't lie on the floor and also the adult not having to step on some Lego? And so if we're going to live and build more, and we're going to live in a house which does not have its own grounds, we need to make some more shared space. And that was interesting, isn't it? The fact that if you haven't got enough room, and I think this does building more, building beautiful, has to extend to say, what is the necessary infrastructure? We need libraries, and we need to recognize that if people are in temporary accommodation, there has to be room to crawl. And so here's a project by one of your other, in the borough of the former mayor, one of the other authors, Sir Robin Wales, which has a huge number of people in temporary accommodation. What is beautiful, light coming through the window. Again, if floor-to-ceiling heights are higher, the windows can have better proportions and still bring the light in. They can actually become rectangular. Perhaps the new green paper will insist that every window meets the golden section, and inspectors will walk around with big sort of templates to check. Why not? Is it beautiful for light to come through a window when you're having a bath? Here are plans of 4 prize-winning schemes, relatively low build, 1 prizes with brick facades and balconies you can stand on. Not one has a bathroom with a window. Is that necessary? How does one go beyond the empirical of just size to experience? And so this, again, is this is the last quote from the document, Building More, Building Beautiful. So I'm just going to read it. No thought is given to any sort of character, like Victorian properties, with those little steps here and there, and you know that does something to you when your house is thoughtfully designed. It brings out things in you, and when I look at new builds, they look just like boxes, meager boxes. This building, this room, this flight of stairs, these cupboards, just before demolition is, of course, Robin Hood Gardens, which in many ways does realise this ambition. And it's another point. No architect draws the interiors of housing these days. And so my proposal is, if we say that beauty is the thing to be struggled over, that it's necessary that we care, it's necessary to take care, it's necessary to make time to care, which means the time and the fees to draw. It's necessary to end right to buy, but it's also necessary to make important of going beyond skin deep. And I'm just going to end with an anecdote. So this is the wall of the completed small pavilion for the Hypercaust in Verulamium, a little museum pavilion. When I stood up to a planning committee, slightly less people than here, I described this project, described what it was made out of, precast concrete, and there was an audible sort of retraction. And then I said, but it is the aggregate is made and sprinkled with crushed oyster shells. At this point, there was an audible, And was it the memory of an oyster or the knowledge that actually oyster shells can interfere and reflect light? It was given planning permission. Of course, concrete is a Roman material, and the aggregate was oyster shells. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Many thanks, Liza. I think room to crawl and bathrooms with windows would be top of my policies if I became mayor. Next, we have Andrew Whitaker, who is the planning director of the Home Builders Federation, here to represent the house builders. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Oliver, and good evening. I'm a chartered town planner. I'm not an architect, and I make no apologies for it, because I'm just about to say some rude things about architects. I was going to stick to the brief, of beauty and what do people want. And I thought I'd have some audience participation, not least because I know that Ollie will give me extra time for audience participation. So here we go. Here are 3 ties. They're all exactly the same design, but they've all got different patterns on the outside of them. Now, I know a lot of you will say, ties, what are ties? I'm, kind of young and down with the kids now, so I don't wear a tie for work anymore. but please, for these purposes, you'll have to put your hand in the air. So there's a nice stripy tie. Who likes the nice stripy tie of all the 3 ties? Who likes the stripy tie? Great, thank you. Who likes the spotty tie? Yellow spotty tie, best. And who likes the plaid, the blue plaid tie? Who doesn't believe in ties and thinks that they didn't want to vote? Yeah, absolutely. I was kind of interested in that voting process because you all had a free vote. You could all make up your own mind. They're all exactly the same design of tie. Yet some of you think that one of them is nicer than the other, and the other too. Curiously, a thing about ties, the stripy tie. British stripy ties stripe down from left to right. American stripy ties stripe down from right to left. You'll remember that for the rest of your life, and you've learned something tonight. So people make different choices based on very similar things. And you can't tell whether things are similar or not when you make that choice. Here are 2 cars. The top one is a Fiat 500X. The bottom one is a Jeep Cherokee. They've called it something else now, a Renegade. The Jeep Renegade. 2 totally different cars, except they're not. They share 80% of their insides. They're built on exactly the same platform. They use a lot of common bits. They just bend the metal in a slightly different way to make what people perceive as 2 very different cars. And people who go out and buy a Fiat 500X will say, I love my Fiat 500X. Nothing engenders more of a concern about beauty than people who love cars. There is a massive disparity. If I'd have put all the cars up and you'd all have voted, I reckon we would have got a lot more disparity on which was the most beautiful car than we did about your choice of ties. So you can't tell just by looking at something whether it's actually different to something else. And that goes for houses as well. People talk about houses today and they say, oh, modern houses, they're all a load of rubbish. They all look like boxes. They are stunningly different to how they used to be many years ago in some ways. Building regulations make sure of that, and it changes things, and regulation is something that kind of either competes with beauty or limits some of the beauty. So are we just talking about fashion? Here's, I had some fantastic animations on these slides, but they've all been turned into a PDF. But anyway, here we go. I'm looking around the room, and most of the audiences I talk to have an average age of about 58 or something. And I'm looking around the audience today, and the average age in here is approximately 29. So my guess is that very few of you will have played on the 1995 version of the PlayStation 1, which is up in the top left-hand corner, whereas lots of you may well have played on the current version of the PlayStation 4. Very similar design principles to a PlayStation. There's a box and there's a controller. Look at the controller. The controller of the PlayStation has hardly changed in over 20 years. Yet, they are fundamentally different machines. They do very different things in a very different way. And even the controller buzzes and vibrates, and the first controller didn't do all of that. And therefore, it's changed, but they look the same. They're called the same thing. So how do we know they're beautiful? Right, this is really going to go over the top of your 29-year-old heads. Here we go. This is Play School. And I blame these guys for why we are having this debate. These guys here, they were on TV. For those of you who don't know Play School, it's a children's program, Watch with Mother. It was on TV from 1963 to 1988. How many of you remember Play School? Thank God for that. Right, so you'll be able to name all of the characters. Come on. Anybody? Who's the big egg-shaped thing in the middle? Go on, even those of you who haven't seen Play School will know who that is. Humpty, excellent. What about the Big Ted? Oh, no, I've given it away. Big Ted. What about his mate? Well, Little Ted, yes, Little Ted. Right, and now it comes to only the aficionados of Play School will know this. What about the rag doll? Jemima. Awesome. And now are you going for the full house, madam? You can get it if you can get the doll on the end, the one with the porcelain face, the traditional doll. Come on, you can do it. I've got faith in you. Handball. We've got a winner. I'm sorry, madam. You've lost out to the last minute. We're out there at handball. Anyway, why do I blame these guys? Because these guys are responsible for how we think of a house and what we think of as a beautiful house. And every child in the Western world, if you ask them to draw a house, will draw you something that looks like Play School. It's a box with a roof with 4 windows and a door. That is a classic house, and that is what we continue to emulate. And Roger can bang on about architectural structures and this, that, and the other, and we can talk about wonderful. People think houses are beautiful if they look like their concept of a house. How do I know that? Because people have tried to build other kinds of houses. This one in the top left, this is a passive house. You might have heard of passive house. You might have even designed a passive house, or passive house. This one down the bottom, this is not in London. That's in London, the passive house. This is not in London. This is, you might be able to tell, because in the background is Lincoln Cathedral. This house is in Lincoln. And then this tower block is just down the road here at 9 Elms, Hayden Tower. They have all been nominated as Carbuncle of the Year in various years by the Building Design magazine. They were all designed by an architect. I'm assuming that the architect thought they were beautiful when they were designed. Because I can't believe an architect wakes up in the morning and says, do you know what, I'm going to build something that's rubbish today. I'm going to build something that's ugly today. I'm going to build something that is not beautiful. Everyone who designed these did it for a reason, and they thought it was beautiful. But surely I'm just talking about the outsides of houses. What I should really be talking about is how houses fit together, about urban design. I went to planning college. It might have been a long time ago, but I did go to planning college. And I had both of these books in my repertoire. Well, actually, I took them out of the library because I was too poor or too tight to buy all of my textbooks. I'm sure none of you do that. You all go out and buy textbooks so that all these people can make money. Anyway, these were the 2 tomes of urban design that every planning student had in their satchel. The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs and The Image of the City by Kevin Lynch. Jane Jacobs was published in 1961, Kevin Lynch in 1960. I guarantee you that if you go on an urban planning course today, these 2 books will be on your reading list because they set the fundamentals of urban design in the Western world and Western architecture. And if we don't conform to these principles, we will not think that the place is beautiful because it doesn't conform to our standard idea of what urban design means in terms of beauty. So, how do we know that? What can we do about that? Can the industry cope with anything? Yes, it can. We developed Building for Life, the HBF, the Home Builders Federation, the industry, the house building industry, said, we want to have a discussion about what beauty means. We get pulled up at planning committees saying, that's a terrible design, that is not a beautiful house. And we said, what do you mean it's not a beautiful house? This is my last slide, and I had audience participation. They should have put their hands up quicker. We designed Building for Life with the Civic Trust, the industry. It's been refined over the years. We did this in 2001, and we're now on this iteration, which is BFL 12. That allows us to have a conversation with people about what it is they think is beautiful, what they think is good urban design, and it overcomes the problem of people saying, I don't like that. And before you say that you are not one of those people, may I remind you that you voted for a tie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for introducing audience participation. And now we know that Play School is the root of the housing crisis, all along. Next up, we have Deborah Garvie, Policy Manager at housing charity Shelter. Thank you.
Hi. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me. For people who don't know much about Shelter, every year we work with millions of people. We advise millions of people through our website, get advice pages, face-to-face, on the telephone, about bad housing and homelessness. So we've got a fair idea about what people want from their homes. Last year we've been working throughout the year on this report, Vision for Social Housing, which was published a couple of weeks ago. And that was an independent panel of people from across the political spectrum. So we had George Clark, the Channel 4 architect, Doreen Lawrence, Saeed Avasi and Ed Miliband, and also survivor of Grenfell Tower fire, Ed Defan. And they've put forward their views on what needs to happen in terms of social housing provision. And what we're now going to be looking at in the coming few years is what those homes need to look like. But today I want to talk to you about people. It's not going back now. Here we are. About people, because although Roger has mentioned people in his presentation, homes are machines for people to live in. And if you're talking about beauty, then also it's really, really important that beauty is in the functionality of the home. So here are a few people that we've been working with recently. This is Shandor and his son Billy. Shandor lost his home because he had an accident at work and he got into rent arrears and lost his home. And him and Billy lived in a homeless hostel for 8 months when Billy was 8 years old. Then this is Laura and her family. That's actually Laura's mother and Laura's children. Her mum lives with her. So Laura works full-time. They were evicted from their private rental 3 years ago. And they were in the Panorama programme, evicted for no reason. And they were placed in a homeless bed and breakfast. It stank of urine. There appeared to be blood stains on the mattresses, some kind of stain anyway. And they had no heating in the accommodation. But worse still, they had no beds because the landlord that had evicted them wouldn't allow them to go back and get their furniture. So the children were sleeping on the floor. And this is Reese. Reese is 10. He lives with his mum, Tracy, and his dad, Anthony. They're in a private rental in North London. Tracy and Anthony have worked all their life since leaving school, but they were evicted just before Christmas. And then on Christmas Eve, Tracy was called to A&E where she was told that she had an aggressive form of leukemia. Reese has asthma. The home that they were placed in by the council was just so damp that Tracy struggles to breathe when she wakes up every morning, even though she needs somewhere safe to avoid getting any infections because of her illness. She's been bidding for social housing for 9 years. 55% of homeless families in temporary accommodation are in work. Andrew spoke about choice, having choice in where you live or what you choose to be beautiful. These are working families and they have no choice over where they live. Just to give you a sense of something else which Liza mentioned, which is very important, which is space. We did some polling 4 years ago now, when we were doing some work on national space standards in housing. And what we found, obviously, we already knew that people would support housing development if the homes were better designed and in keeping with the local area. And what we found through our polling of thousands of people, was that people were most likely to support new development if the homes had enough space. And that wasn't because they thought their area would look better, and it was sort of rooted in Nimbyism. When we asked them why, the biggest reason, 62%, was because it would be better for the people that move in. Barton Wilmore volunteered with us a few years ago. We published the Green Book on the 50th anniversary of shelter being established in 1966. And these were some drawings that their volunteer architect did for us. These were families we were working with at the time in temporary accommodation. On the left, a family of 7 in a room 12 by 8 foot. When they had all the beds out, you can see what the sleeping arrangements were. There was a baby in that household, that their eldest daughter also had a baby. Absolutely no room for their stuff at all. And the one on the right, this was a mother and son in a basement room, no natural light. At the top of the picture there, the sort of window they did have looked out onto the bins. And in the top left hand, that's water coming in because they woke up one morning and the mobile phones were floating on about 2 inches of water. This is how people are living now. And this is what we need to bear in mind when we're designing homes. People need somewhere decent, and particularly in terms of space. So I just wanted to talk about an exemplar of somewhere that I think is really beautiful. I know it might be controversial, and it's certainly in childlike colours. But it's somewhere that I think is beautiful because the people that live in it find it incredibly beautiful. And this is temporary accommodation built by Lewisham Council in Ladywell. And it's off-site construction. It was completed 2.5 years ago. And the units, as you can see, were brought in on the backs of trucks. This is the sort of accommodation that people have in these units. So it's a 2-bedroom unit, but has a very large storage room. Both the bedrooms are double aspect. And the people that live here, there's a really good film, which I've put a link to, and I would urge people to watch, people talking about living in this accommodation. But one woman talks about how when they first moved in, her son couldn't sleep because he was so bowled over. And when he woke up in the morning, he just said, "Look, Mummy, it's so beautiful. Look, I can't believe we're living here." The living room, adaptable space. The kitchen, really workable. This was another man who was looking after 2 teenage girls. He was the only person, because of family loss, that could look after them anymore. And he said, this home has given us a different vision for the future. They'd been living in other forms of temporary accommodation, like the ones I've described, up until then. And another thing that I really love about this development is they don't just have balconies that you maybe could just about step onto, or that you might keep your bike on, or your mop and bucket, and all the other things that we see people using their balconies for if you walk round. They actually have covered terraces, which in the summer you could have your dining table out here. Children can actually play. This is actually one of the smaller ones, some are larger. And people absolutely love this outside space, and I urge anyone that's considering beauty of design to consider outside space. So important that you have usable outside space. So this is what the homes look like now. On the ground floor, there's a community cafe run by the Jimmy Mizzen Foundation. Jimmy Mizzen was stabbed in a takeaway, and his parents set up a foundation in his name. And there's also little work units where people can have their start-up businesses. And another of the mothers who lives in these flats said if they built more of these, it has the potential to make a much bigger, better community because of the spaces downstairs. So what I'd leave you with is, if we're thinking about beauty, beauty has to be about how it makes you feel when you live in that home and how it allows you to live your life. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Deborah, for that eye-opening presentation. And finally, I want to introduce Neil Pinder from Graveney School. Thanks.
Right, don't be alarmed. It's Miles Davis, Freddie Freeloader playing in the background. So it's not no interference. Right, can you hear me nice and loud?
Yeah.
Right, I've just put it a little bit louder so you can relax and listen to the music. Right, here we go. I mean, this is my first one. Don't time this. This is not part of my 5 minutes, please. Right. Thanks very much for inviting me to give my impression of beauty in the built environment. I'm a product design teacher and architecture teacher at Graveney Secondary School. I'm also a yogi. Let me get, where's my pressing thing's gone? Oh, there it is. Right. Right, there we are. I'm in love with I have a passion for London and all that it stands for. Nowhere has the rich mix of London, British born and from every corner of the world, rich and poor, black and white, old and young, LGBTQ+. It has the openness, a vibrancy, a diversity that for me simply makes it the best city in the whole world. Oh, sorry, I've been pressing, have I? Right. Sorry, let me just... Oh, my order's gone. Oh, there we are. Like many Londoners, my ancestry comes from somewhere else. This is my great-grandparents' house in Barbados. It's a wooden chattel house in the parish of St. George, where many slaves working on the plantations were housed. Generations of my family were brought up here, and a few years ago, I had the pleasure to renovate it. And it's a simple structure, but a beautiful one to me. As a teacher, I'm open to all forms of architecture. I want my students to learn and be able to choose what they find beautiful. But in my heart, I'm a minimalist. I love the fantastic geometric forms, the space, the simplicity, and the repetition of structure. It's more style of architecture and living that's urban, open, optimistic, and my kids told me at school to put this in, beautiful like me. I also love my football. I run my own football youth team, and I'm an out-and-out gooner, supporting Arsenal for those people who don't know the vernacular. And I'm a bit of a traditionalist in other ways. Sometimes when I'm walking to the Emirates, I go through Highbury Fields and stop to admire the grandeur, the symmetry of the Georgian terraces and the solidity of the Victorian buildings. It's beautiful in the eye of this beholder. The Emirates Stadium, The Emirates is a beautiful stadium to me. Sports architecture at its finest. No viewing limiting stanchions, great sight lines, and most important, no exposure to the element stands. But let us return to the matters in hand. I believe there's more to architecture than simple aesthetics. It cannot and does not stand neutral in this great cultural debate of our times. Beyond the aesthetics, there's often ideology, and few terms are more charged than classicism. This is an essentially politically and socially regressive ideology masquerading in an aesthetic movement. In harking back as it does to the 18th and 19th century England, it ignores the reality of most of the people of the times, the slums of Southwark and Cheapside, and the sheer hopelessness of life for the poor. It's a situation that still persists in certain areas today. Dickens called it a shameful testimony to future ages, how civilization and barbarism walk this boastful island together. Here we are. Is it any wonder that the attempt to recreate this classical ideals seems to be destined to end in failure or ridicule? There might not be a carbuncle in sight, but there's not a lot of originality or imagination either. And it's delusional to think we can go back, and it is unimaginative to want to do so. So, what does beautiful architecture look like to me? Well, it's not necessarily about aesthetics or schools of architecture. Here we are. Rather, it's about the future, which those who live in the built environment have a say in its conception. An architecture that is more inclusive, where the best is not reserved for the wealthiest, and where governments does not decide where and how the poorest in society live. It's about releasing the potential of individuals and communities, an architecture that gives a voice to those who are making their voices heard through the videos of grime. Recent events in Grenfell have shown that a top-down way of working is no longer feasible. That is why I am so keen to bring forward the new generation of architects and engineers from non-traditional backgrounds to work in the profession that is still dominated by one class and largely by one set. I recently took a group of 17 and 18-year-old students from my school to the workshop at Karakusevich Carson. It was the first day of the half-term holiday, but all of them turned up and on time outside of the train station. They were totally engaged and inspired, and we made a film called Taking the Biscuit, and it's on YouTube if you want to have a look. These are the future of architecture, and the future is beautiful. And I always finish my class in school with, the inner light in me honors and recognizes the beautiful inner light in you. Namaste.
Fantastic. I think we should leave Marilyn on as our backdrop, maybe, for the debate. Could I invite all of our speakers to join me on stage, ideally in the order in which you spoke? And can I also please ask the audience to be busy thinking up questions, provocations, challenges to our panel? So I'm going to begin just very briefly before handing over, because I know you've come here to participate. So I'll just ask a couple of questions before opening it up, if Liza will sit down.
Yeah, no, I just one of those people I can't think without to.
Well, firstly, thank you all for your great 5-minute plus provocations. Can I just start? I want to accept, to begin with, the premise of the commission that there is some kind of gulf between what people want, what the public wants, and what developers and house builders and architects are providing at the moment, just to begin with. And if that is true, if we're to accept that opening premise, what methods can we use to find out what people want? Because I think some of the methods in the Policy Exchange report, which include surveys that ask, do you prefer dramatic and futuristic designs as opposed to traditional terraces with tree-lined streets, aren't necessarily the kind of neutral way of surveying that we might go about. So what methods can we use to actually find out what people want and let people feel like they're feeding into how they're shaping their own communities? Who wants to go first?
Well, I can add something. One method is house prices. Do the prices go up when the houses are resold, or do they go down? You know, that's an indication that people want to be there, and it is quite indicative, of course, you know, that Neil showed a picture of the real estate agent in Poundbury, his adverts for the houses on sale there. Of course, they've shot up in price and are continually doing so. That's a sign of what people want, what they're prepared to pay. I'm not saying it's the only sign, and of course it's only a sign of what the upper middle classes actually want. And it's one of the great problems, how you discover people's real desires, especially in a world where they're not necessarily conscious of them.
Liza, how do you determine? Sorry.
Do you want to jump in on
Yeah, you
that?
want to go? Yeah, if you want to respond.
One of the ways I think they can actually learn is for planners, for architects, and for all the people who are involved in the built environment to go and actually live in that society for 6 months and a year. And then once they've got a feel for the people, instead of just designing for themselves, in my view, and once you've got a feel for the people and the community, and we're all a community, this is the best, to me, this is the best city in the whole world. And because it's the best city, we're the most integrated, the most socially, racially, and everything else integrated in the whole world. And we have everybody at our fingertips that we can call upon. But we let a certain minority of people just come and tell us what they think that we want. Whereas if they were to actually engage with everybody in that particular area, or a large majority of that people, they would actually realise they may not want this, they may not want that, and they like this. And instead of asking a survey that you need a master's degree in whatever to understand.
Liza, as the only architect on the panel, how do you find out what your clients want?
There's a number of things that happen. Sometimes architects operate as fund managers. So I don't know how many working architects are in this room, but who design efficiently for maximum return. When you're working for a local authority, as we are at the moment, that quid pro quo of trying to get the max for the private houses within a development in order to create money to build social housing and build a mixed-use new scheme takes a lot of effort. But that's one of the things is motivation. You know, what are people drawing and why are they drawing it? The education of architects teaches them to be snake oil purveyors. The education is to stand up and defend your project, to put your elbow over the bit you didn't quite draw properly, and to generally be persuasive. And the way to take that away is, as you say, Neil, is for architects to operate as if they are operating for clients. And that takes time and care and means that the generic, like the cover of Building More, Building Beautiful, you know, the unthought out, the slam together will not do. And if that poor illustrator had had longer, they probably wouldn't have made that terrible boo-boo. But they were probably told to do it fast. They didn't read the report, knock it out, put a bit of wallpaper on. And I think that we can learn a lot from it, that it needs that care and the demand for transparency, the demand for open book, so people don't say, oh, sorry, we can't build what we said we'd build. So you need enforcement so that people don't build something completely different to what they drew, because that makes a gap. Your point about people only buy beautiful things is not right in London, because people buy the types of buildings that you say are ugly, because then they rent them out so that local authorities spend and individuals spend huge amounts of money in order to continue living in the city, because people buy units, not as homes, but as commodities. So in a very long answer, but there is all of those things.
Yeah.
That if you could just have that relationship, it would be okay.
Andrew, are your house builders building what people want?
Absolutely they are.
Do they have a choice?
Of course they do. Everyone in the private sector house buying market has a massive choice, because they can go and buy a house that's already built, They don't have to buy a new build house. I love this idea that we can all go and feel the place and feel the area and find out what works for us in that area. I can't be bothered with all of that. Why would I want to do that? Surely the pinnacle of what do people want is to let them go and do it themselves. And the self-build industry is really quite an interesting phenomenon because it's gathering pace at the moment, and we're seeing a lot more self-build projects. And I would urge you to go and see self-build projects. They are horrendous, absolutely horrendous. There's one in Liverpool, absolutely terrible. Everyone who bought a plot builds to within a metre of the side of the plot, and they are a mishmash of architectural styles, no street scene, nothing.
So leave it to the house builders?
Go to Bicester, Graven Hill at Bicester. It's a project of 1,900 self-build plots. That has been design coded to within an inch of its life. People are not allowed to just build anything where they want to build. They have to follow a design code that has been imposed on them for planning reasons, because people generally want to see pleasant. They don't want to leave it up to individuals. Please don't leave everything up to individuals. They'll all choose the stripy tie, for heaven's sake.
Roger, briefly, and then...
Yes,
Deborah.
I think one must distinguish two classes of people. The one who is going to be in the house and the one who's going to be looking at it. And there are a lot more people who are going to be looking at it than the one who's in it. And I think what the real problem, why there are so many protests which impede the planning process, is that there are so many people who have to look at these things. And they won't have the thrill of being in them when released from homelessness or anything like that. There they have to confront the loss of value of their own property, all the other things that have come with these projects. So I think it's going to be very difficult knowing exactly how you respond to public opinion, given that disparity between the two classes of people.
Deborah, having met and interviewed so many residents, what's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say, first of all, is that I don't think house prices are a reflection of the popularity of the design. I think they're a reflection of our housing crisis. And people, house prices are going up across the board, including things that you'd probably consider to be very, very poor design. But what I'd also like to mention is, the statistic I gave before, which is when we've polled people, this is, over 3,000 people in YouGov polling, and asked them, why do you think design matters? Why is it your top thing, for you supporting new building? They have said because it's better for the people living in it. It's not because it's better for me and my house price and because I have to look at it, because people don't mind maybe the field they walk their dog on being used for development, instead of, them having that view from their kitchen window, as long as those homes are suitable for the people that are going to move into them. What they don't want to see is for that land to go or for that view to go and the homes be completely dysfunctional. That people are very much altruistic about house building and design. But just to follow on from what you said, I do think it's so important to sound out people about what they really need and what they really want, and actually act on that, because people are often asked what they want and they say very clearly what they want and then they're ignored. Yeah. So that's another thing. But finally, just to say, I think it's very important to ensure that we listen to people that don't always have a voice, and that can include people that don't currently live in the area as residents because they're homeless and they're in a homeless hostel in the next town, who often don't have a voice in these things. Children, when you're a child, your home, your street, the route to the park, up the road, that is your world. That's the entirety of your world, unless you're lucky enough to be ferried around in a car elsewhere. And the home is very, very important for children. Space to play, relationship to neighbours and things like that. And, that's why a lot of estate-based housing is actually great for kids, because it's, they're not having to negotiate roads where they might get knocked over by a car. And finally, the longevity is the final thing I say. There's this great book by Julie Myerson, who I'm not over keen on as a writer, but it's called Home, The History of Everyone That's Lived in My House. And that's a Victorian terrace house in South London. And she managed to find out every single person that had ever lived there. And people had lived in there as one house, people had lived in there as one room, with let from others. And over the lifetime of a building, it's going to be used in lots of different ways. And we need to consider who might live here in 50 years' time, who might live here in 100 years' time, as well as, who might need it now.
Can I just say one thing?
Very briefly, I'm going to open it up.
When you say
get your questions ready.
Right, when you say there's a choice, there isn't any choice. An area is made up, number one, if it's got a school that's risen up the league tables, that house becomes really expensive. If it's got good amenities, Cafe Nero and whatever, it becomes an expensive area. And then the actual choice of the people who move in there is limited because you're limited by how much you can afford. So a £500,000 one-bedroom or two-bedroom flat, the people who can afford that are not start-up teachers. They're not the service industry, the early doctors, the firemen, the policemen, etc. So you're not talking about choice. You're talking about an exclusiveness of people who can go to certain areas and who can afford to do a self-build, can afford to do this. There's no choice. There's no choice whatsoever.
Right, we have two roving microphones in the audience, I believe. Yes, there's one over there. Okay, the first hand to go up was on the front row, so we'll take that first. Stand up so I can see. Okay, and then we'll have a second question here.
Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah, right. I so agree with your last point. A lot of the speakers have spoken as though architects have power and the purchaser has power. They have very little power. What we have is dictates coming from central government. It was published only yesterday that in this country, we have sold off more public assets than France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Australia, and Canada put together. Those assets include libraries, public utilities, schools, and land. Without land, you can't do anything. Of course, a lot of that land was being used for other purposes, like school playing fields. We're being dictated to, by the house building industry, which is backed and subsidizes the government. And you are being extremely profligate with land. We know, and Roger here has illustrated it, that your traditional terraced house, especially in London, of course, is extremely popular and fetches very high prices. But do the volume house builders want to build terraces? No, they do not. Built to extremely low densities, and of course, it's all car dependent, and therefore, of course, we have ever increasing pollution in our city streets, and we're never going to meet our greenhouse targets as agreed with the Paris Accord.
Okay. Andrew, would you like to respond first to
yes,
that?
but are they beautiful? That's you've got so many questions wrapped up in that opinion.
Terrace houses.
Yes,
the
are
Georgian
terrace houses
terrace.
beautiful?
Well, I've
The
no idea.
Georges and Victorian
Are you saying
terrace is
terraced
one
houses are beautiful? Is that the
She's
point
saying
that you're
they
making?
take up more less land. They take up less land, so you can build more of them.
They certainly fetch a high price on the market, if that's the measure.
Right. Well, I didn't put forward that as a measure. That was Roger's measure. That price was what makes beautiful.
That's a bit unfair.
There are.
I think it's the other way around.
It's all unfair, Roger.
Makes price.
That's the point of debate. There are lots and lots of different kinds of house being built by the house building industry and by people for themselves. There is choice. There is choice of location. There's choice of different kinds of house type for everybody. Not everywhere. That's because the planning system does a whole load of things to the system of land and stops people from building what they might want to build in a particular place.
How do you work out this choice? I'm trying to work this out. How do you work out there's a choice? Where is the choice? Tell me. Explain to me. Where is the choice?
Yeah. Can I just add one thing here? That there is for many people, there is no choice. For the homeless person, there is no choice. And you have to have a housing policy, therefore, that looks after the homeless. And that means there has to be transfer of assets from the wealthy from those who can buy their own house to those who can't. And the question is, what method do you use that doesn't create other problems in its wake? That's what Shelter is presumably working on. And I think most governments are aware of this problem. We used to try and solve it by social housing, which was built by the local government and remained property of the local government. Then, of course, as we know, we had the sort of big sell-off of all that. Many people feel that was a tremendous mistake. But the question is, it's happened. What do you put in the place of it?
So, Roger, is the Beauty Commission a decoy? Is it a distraction from actually solving these real issues that Shelter has been researching?
I sometimes fear that it is. I'm here in order to make it look as though something's being done. All I know is that insofar as I've been asked to do something, is to confront this question of why people object to things being built in their neighbourhood.
But it may not be the most urgent question you're saying.
I think if you understand beauty correctly, and this is emerging from this discussion, it isn't simply a matter of the surface appearance of things. It does have to do with the adaptability and the fitting in of the building into its environment. And if fully understood, I think you might actually come to see that in the end, beauty is what building is about. But it's only so because it's also about people.
Great, we'll take the second question.
Excellent, and I think as Roger is very good at writing books, you write a lot of books.
All right, no.
You've written a lot of books, and I get that if you read it, because I'm very obedient, so I come to a different, I sort of read it. It could do with a bit of an edit, and it could do with a single hand. And I think if, Roger, you could just give it a quick...
You're talking about this policy
object,
exchange
yeah,
report.
that document.
That
Apparently you're an author. It says you're an author on the front.
I wrote one page.
Yeah,
Just
I
wait
think
for
you've
volume
got
two and then...
You need to, Roger, they say you are a co-author with the deposed Mayor of Newham and another bloke. You need to take that document. It could be quite a slim one, maybe more than one page.
Well, that's what the result of the commission will be.
And maybe the result of today is this stronger piece of work which actually speaks. I think you probably know more people in this current administration than we do, that you could just tell them that it's time, end right to buy, allow local authorities to borrow money, build these mixed tenure communities, have higher ceilings,
Why don't
get
you
the
write
light
a draft
in.
and
No,
I
you do
will
it.
rewrite
You
it
do
in
it.
proper English.
Okay, we'll write it together. Thank you. Thank
Okay,
you.
second question.
Excellent.
Go.
Yeah.
Okay, mainly directed to Andrew. You mentioned that you thought Neil's approach to, I'd call it bottom-up or a more humanised design, that you thought that sounded like a nice idea, but as a town planner, it's something that you couldn't, it's not something that you're bothered to do. In the wake of the Grenfell Tower, I'm wondering if, 200 dead bodies are worth the cladding, the aesthetic choice to cover the building in cladding, and whether you think those people could be bothered to think about living within the building.
What a terrible question. What a terrible question. I'm not even going to answer that because I cannot excuse what happened at Grenfell Tower, can I? I cannot say that those people had a choice. I just cannot answer your question. It's a stupid question.
I've asked a simple question, but you have every right not to answer it. Someone else can respond.
Would anyone else on the panel like to respond to the question?
I think we can talk about appearance. I mean, in the London Borough of Kensington Chelsea, a choice was made to reclad that building so that other people would enjoy looking at it more, which was something we talked about earlier, and that is.
That was one of the reasons.
Ask Deb. That was as well recorded that with the building of Westfield, there was a decision made to make that building look more attractive to look at. That's true, isn't it? It's in the
one of
commission.
many reasons.
Had it not been so ugly to begin with, the whole problem would not have arisen.
The people who lived there had a full account of what needed doing, and what the decision was made to concentrate on the outside cladding rather than sorting out the inside. I think that is
But partly to try and make it more energy efficient as well.
I think I can't say
Appearance.
what the reasons were
No,
that
but
the cladding was
appearance.
used, and I think we have to wait for the inquiry to talk about that.
Well,
But what I would say about
documented they
Grenfell
chose to
Tower
smart
is that people really loved their flats in that building. Really large living rooms and actually very adaptable space. And so, it was certainly, in some ways, in terms of the flats anyway, a well-designed building in the first place, although obviously there were issues about fire escapes and those kind of things. But I think, absolutely, it's so important that, to go back to your question, that people are asked what matters to them. And certainly when people do live in taller buildings, then obviously one of the first things you do think about is how would you get out of the building if you had to, whether that's a high-end development, where the flats are being sold for £1 million each, or whether it's social housing. And I think it's it doesn't matter who the residents are going to be. It's very important that people's sort of intrinsic concerns about living in a place are taken into account.
Yeah. I think from the fact of Grenfell is that money was placed over the actual lives of people, because you can clad something, and from all the reports that you've seen and read up to today, they took a cheap option, and it's one of these things where you go to service all the time, you're thinking about profit. We need to make sure our shareholders are adequately taken care of. So we need to, for these sort of people, we make sure that we, cut back on the aluminium and cut back on this. But when you've got a building like number 1, Hyde Park, Candy, where no expense is spared, and you can sell an apartment for 48 million. Nobody asks any questions there.
Standards.
Yeah.
Can we move on to the next questions to keep this going? Are there any further back in the shadows that I can't see?
Hello.
Yes, there.
Hi.
Okay, great.
I'm Inigo Time. I'm an architect, and I'm going to sound like Wittgenstein, but I was very surprised that no one even started as a fundamental with a definition of beauty. So that's going to be my question. What is your one-sentence definition of beauty?
Great. One-sentence definition of beauty. Beginning with Roger. You should be the most prepared to answer this.
Any one-sentence definition of beauty is bound to be wrong. We have a sense of the beautiful. There's the sense that something is worth contemplating for its own sake. And that's something that we all have embedded in us. And it's something that we argue about because we believe that it matters. And as Immanuel Kant said, in the judgment of beauty, we are suitors for agreement. We try to find what the other person thinks is beautiful and to bring him either to agree with us or to correct our opinion to agree with his. So it's a kind of society-forming sense of the intrinsic meaning of things. How about that?
Very well put. Liza, one sentence.
Yeah.
Incomplete. And so open to appropriation, which I think is a sort of rewording of that. And there's a long, long time ago, someone described a winter sunset the moment the winter sunset hit centre point, they were talking about the sunset more than the building. I think that's beautiful. That's a definition of beauty.
Andrew.
A subjective opinion of an individual that sometimes aligns with other individuals.
Interesting. Deborah.
Joy in the heart.
Very succinct. Neil.
Mm-hmm. Beauty, I think, comes from within. And I think that we all have a perception of or a standard of what we think is beautiful. And unfortunately, it gets diluted by the people who are in power think that their beautiful is better than our beautiful. But we are beautiful.
Excellent. We've got time for 2 more questions. There was one here. Yeah, we'll take that one and then here. So just in the middle here.
Yes?
I've got a question, if we're in the interlude. It was about what people want and what they need. And I wondered if everyone's talking about desire being a product of beauty. I questioned that, and I just wanted to know what the panel thought about picking apart that want and need, and whether which one really produces beauty.
Very good question.
Could you, where was that question coming from?
Right at the back, sorry, I just
the
took...
mystery voice.
It's over here.
Separating want and need.
Well, that little thing which popped up on the slide, which showed what people thought about wall thicknesses, and, you know, I thought that was more of a question as necessity, which actually could produce some good answers to beauty. But in relation to what people want, i.e. like desire, is that really a good source or a good fundamental for beauty?
Yeah. I would say this is a really good question. It's absolutely vital to distinguish desires from needs. Desires are temporary things which, when fulfilled, go away. A need is part of our nature, and it remains through a lifetime if it's not satisfied. And I think that architecture and beauty as well should be aimed at satisfying the deeper needs of people rather than what they happen momentarily to desire. And I would illustrate that by my little example of the children, the way in which their taste is educated to match their real social needs as opposed to their childish, flippant desires.
Liza?
I disagree. I doubted that child actually went and painted that room apple green with their own little hand and their own little paint pot, and that bright colours, and I'm not going to get involved in your bright colours. They do tend, the further you get out of London, the poorer the borough, the brighter the colours. And if you look at the work, and Richard Rogers is an exception to this, actually. You could say it shows integrity, because he has a bright pink pizza oven in Chelsea, as well as the housing he makes in Lewisham. But there's other architects who, so I'm just changing the subject slightly to the thing to children. Now, I'm just responding to you. I just like forget this thing about children. This notion of children and the poor have things sort of projected onto them, and so there's a lot of situations where neither needs or desires are met at the moment. But I enjoyed
or should we go to the...
Yeah.
Briefly?
I think the crux of it really is the two pillars of design, I suppose, functionality and beauty. And obviously something has got to have functionality. I mean, I think the classic that's always used is a teapot that looks beautiful on a shelf but it can't pour tea. Of course, a home has got to meet your functional needs, and if it doesn't, then it's a poorly designed home. But it also has to uplift your heart. It also has to make you feel good, whether you're looking at it or whether you're living in it, and the sense of feeling it gives you there. And actually, going back to your play school example, Savills did some work getting children to design their ideal homes, and I've spoken in schools when children are in year 4 and they're learning about habitats, and the schools have got them to kind of design their ideal home. And actually, they don't design the play school house. They design turrets with pointy roofs and colour, and lots of them put, their own AstroTurf football pitch. But in a way, that's what they want. They want somewhere to play, and they want somewhere that looks fantastic. And lots of the designs are very modern and almost like spaceships. And so I do think it's really, really important that we mustn't just think about functionality, but it is how uplifting somewhere is to live as well.
I say to the kids, I say to my students and my kids, if you have half of what you want and all of that you need, then you're somewhere in between being happy.
It's a good motto. Is your microphone working now? Penultimate question.
Yeah. Hello. So there's a kind of long-standing joke that modernist architects live in Georgian houses, and there is a kind of general idea that if you are in the design profession, you're more likely to live somewhere that is unique and slightly more interesting. So a Chipperfield architect would probably be less likely to want to live in a kind of bad knockoff of a Chipperfield building in Tower Hamlets, for example. So if we have that as an idea, and then alongside that, there's the idea that universities not only teach people how to design buildings, but they also teach people about fashion. They are sort of also about how we move through ideas and come up with new ideas and also discard old ideas, and that's how people get jobs, because they're the hot architect or whatever. Do you think if we are, most of the speakers in one way or another are saying the trickle-down effect is broken, it's not working, people are not getting the trickle-down of good design, really. There's a kind of fissure, a crack between the sort of top end of design and the majority, the bottom end. Do you think that the trickle-down is impossible to eradicate given the university system in our societies? Does that make sense?
No.
No. Let me try to sort of explain it.
The kind of cheap knockoff phenomenon, essentially.
Well, just the fact that I think I'm just interested in the idea that there is a kind of upper echelon of designers, be they Adam architects or high-end modernists, and they're designing extraordinarily sophisticated things, extraordinarily beautiful things, irrespective of what sort of architectural style they live. And then there's something else, which is, you know, the rest of taste. Do you think that is ever fixable, given university systems? Given the fact that the architect profession is chosen to teach at universities in order to talk about extraordinarily sophisticated, complicated things, what's fashionable, what isn't fashionable?
I'm going to ask the architect to respond first, and then Neil. So, Liza.
It's difficult without some precision. So when you say, you're saying the outskirts of somewhere that's not London. I mean, would you like to name somewhere as this example?
All right. So, for example, a hypothetical Georgian cul-de-sac somewhere in a rather bad bit of Luton versus a very beautifully designed, high-end, neo-Georgian house, somewhere designed by a very sophisticated architect that knows about Georgian columns.
I'd say things like space standards can really assist in the house in Luton, and particularly floor-to-ceiling heights, because if the rooms are big enough and the windows are big enough to light those rooms, and the hall is wide enough to get through to the back, you're likely to begin to have something that is quite simple and okay. So I think there is a place for minimum standards, and in terms of but the person that draws it is probably not an architect. It might be an architect who gets the planning permission, but one of the latest proposals from the mayor is that the person who gets the planning permission should stay with the process to its conclusion. So the dilution is at the moment structural, that somebody draws it at the beginning, there is almost no planner to go round the corner down the cul-de-sac in Luton to check that the thing that was drawn for that planning stage is the thing which is built. But I think in something as simple as a small neo-Georgian terrace, if the living room's big enough, the window that's sort of placed in the centre is vaguely big enough, floor ceilings are big enough, there probably will begin to be something pretty similar if both of them are copying the same thing.
Can I add to the dreaded word pattern book? Is that something that could be useful?
There are pattern books. Yeah.
But
Neil,
even that's subject to fashion, isn't it? Fashion plays a huge part in design and quality and what we think of as beauty at any particular moment in time. And people will go through various phases of fashion. You know, we used to like integral garages. We thought they were all the rage. Then we realised that we didn't actually want to park our car in garages. So we then designed houses that had a lot of parking on their frontage.
And now you've got suds.
And people thought that was really fantastic.
And now you've got suds.
We
so
go-
you can't
we
put
go
some
through all-
concrete over.
We go through all sorts of different kinds of architectural style and fashion, and we believe that they are the future, and then history kind of tells us that probably they aren't.
Neil.
I think that if you're talking about the educational system, first of all, we have the educational system which has got so much of the higher echelon involved in it, and they set the standards, and it's ironic that you chose Georgian to look at, but they're the ones who are setting the standards, and they're the ones who are making the decisions. But we've got such an open community out here of people who can get into architecture and bring their own individual culture, style, and enthusiasm and passion to architecture, and not let the educational establishment just hijack it all the time with their ideas of what they want. So if we have, and I know you mentioned the top-down that people didn't necessarily agree with, but I tend to work at a grassroots level and get the kids to start to think about their environment, think about where they want to live, think about the things that they think are important. Now, I've been doing a project called the Pavilion Project with kids for a couple of years now. And one of the most important things that any kid would say to you, you say to them, what do you want from a pavilion? Yes, they want to be safe. They want this, they want that. But one of the most important things is Wi-Fi, believe it or not. They'll tell you, we want a free Wi-Fi so they can communicate with each other. But you've got to listen to what the community, what people are saying, and the educationalists have got to start listening to what people are saying and not just imposing this sort of neoclassical or this classical style of Georgian pillars and towers and this and that. A lot of students, a lot of people want to be enthused, but they don't want to be bored stiff at the beginning. They want to be given passion so that their life can be run, or their feelings and emotions can come out in the buildings and the architecture and the places they go, the streets they feel, the places they go to party, eat, you know. That's what they want.
Start early.
Yeah, that's what they want.
Final question, get the microphone over there. Do you still have a question? Yeah, okay, great.
Hiya, Ella Jessel from the Architects Journal. I was just wondering, Ollie, you mentioned about going on the basis of some premises, which obviously we've done, but Roger mentioned that the planning process is that one of the reasons that houses aren't being built is because the planning process is holding things up and impeding. I want to know if the rest of the panel actually agrees that that's the problem, or are there other problems such as like the lack of a government house building programme or other things? Is it a problem? Are local residents holding up planning schemes, or is it a bit of a red herring?
Is Nimbyism our biggest obstacle, Roger?
Well, it's a problem. It's not that people are objecting to things arbitrarily. I mean, these objections are very often very well argued by people who really do feel that not only they have something to lose, but their whole neighbourhood or whatever, or the country as a whole has something to lose. And I think it's not only in England this is occurring.
Sorry to interrupt, really sorry, but recent statistics showed that 97% of planning applications are actually determined within 13 weeks.
Yeah.
So, and there's about 400,000 homes that are approved that are just lying around without being built. So
then that's another problem. One problem is that the planning process is so complicated that you can't get through it in time to salvage your investment, which is one of the things that keeps a small builder out. There's all kinds of economic aspects of this, but if you were asking, well, Oliver was translating your question into a question about Nimbyism, as it's so called. That is a genuine problem. That if people were completely at ease with the things that are promised, and the things that might be built in their neighbourhood, of course there wouldn't be resistance. But all over Europe, unfortunately, there is this resistance. And in Germany in particular, people are getting together to prevent developments which are there thought to be necessary because they don't like the way it's going to look. And one of the problems is that the templates, especially for ordinary town building, the ferro-concrete vernacular, is universally disliked in Europe.
Can I give a different answer to that, which is that...
Well, yes, but my answer is right.
It's
absolutely clear.
All right, we can say
debate,
it's
so Liza.
but again, because you know those people in government, there's these things called the housing targets, which are imposed on local authorities. And interestingly, there are certain constituencies which have a much smaller housing target that they're expected to produce. And it tends to be that in Tory constituencies, the housing targets are much lower. And whereas, particularly, we're familiar with this in London, places which cannot, like Haringey, are given these huge number, thousands of homes that are expected to be built, and if they don't build them, there is a forfeit of the money they have to spend in that area. And I would say that housing targets are the problem, and the commodification of property is the answer to that.
Deborah.
In the back of the report that we've just launched a couple of weeks ago, and it's also on the website, A Vision for Social Housing, we have what we call our mega graph, which shows house building throughout the decades under different prime ministers. And actually, what that graph shows is that private housing development has pretty much stayed around the same amount. But what has meant you've got enough homes being built is the government public house building. And that is the thing that has dropped. And so our analysis is not that it's the planning system that is holding up house building, it's lack of public social house building, and it's also that the land market works in such a way that it often does squeeze out space, it squeezes out good quality of design, because the landowner knows exactly how much, how many units the developer could squeeze onto the plot, how many corners they could cut, and so that's the amount that they'll ask for the land. And so we want to see big reform of the land market as well, to allow for design and space and public housing to be part of new development, but it's certainly not the planning system.
Andrew, house builders often blame the planning system for the lack of houses. What would your take be?
Well, on message about design, I actually think design is frequently used as a red herring for more fundamental objections, whether they're to housing numbers, whether they're to targets, whether they're to all sorts of other things. People will know that they're going to lose that battle, and therefore they will throw in the design card and say, well, I would accept all of those houses out here if they were more beautiful, if they were better designed. And when you actually question them on that as to what they mean by that, they get a little bit more cagey, and they say, well, actually, fundamentally, I'm against the principle of them in the first place. So I turn it the other way around and think that design is often used as the red herring.
Well, if you come back in 4 weeks' time on the 21st of February, we'll be debating planning, beauty in the planning system specifically. Do you want to add a final comment?
I'll just say that when you look at design, and people look at design, generally they know what they want. They know what is beautiful, and they're surrounded by beauty. But I think also the underlying current, and which I don't think was touched upon, when people, they don't want other people to move in their district. They don't want more people they don't recognise in their district. And that is one of the things that you may use as, oh, it's not as beautiful. But generally, people know what beautiful is. But as I said, this sort of underlying right-wing sort of influences from governments and this word populism, which has gone through the sort of system, has mean that so many people backs go up if they hear that this is going to be built, you know, and if this is going to hold 10, you know, 100 people, well, what 100 people is going to be like? And then they say, oh, it's not beautiful.
Well, we're way over time, so I'm going to have to wrap up. And thank all of our speakers for taking part, for their provocations and discussions, and thank you all for coming.